Hi, this is Jenny. I'm here to answer the 14 questions for our video reflection. The first question was, to what extent do you believe all children and youth learn successfully when informed and caring educators assist them and make sufficient resources available to them? How do you demonstrate your beliefs? I believe that every child has the ability to succeed. It really depends on the teacher and obviously parents and other things, but the teacher, how much they believe in their students. I know teachers that before the students even been in their class, just from hearing from other teachers, they say, this student's a troublemaker, they're not going to succeed, they're not going to do well, and that's what happens. So I believe that if you really care about your students, you're going to keep working with them until they learn, until they can do it, and you're not going to give up on them, and that's what makes a difference. I think if you're well informed, then you're going to have the knowledge that you need to teach the students and how to teach them. And if you're informed about your students, you're going to be able to make the lessons meaningful to them, which is going to better allow them to understand the lesson. And I know this has been true for me. I've had students come in that didn't know a letter from a color, and I've had other students that knew the whole alphabet and all their letter sounds. But, I didn't see one student and say, well, this kid doesn't know anything, they're not going to get anywhere. I just said, we've got a lot of work to do. We need to start at a different place than we're going to start with at maybe another student. But, by the end of that year, maybe that student didn't know everything the other student knew. But from where they started, they had gained significant amount. So I think that's just really what we have to keep in mind, that every student can learn, and just teach every individual student. The second question, to what extent do you ensure students are well educated and successful learners? Be specific. Like I said, I differentiate my lessons to reach all students. I ensure that they're well educated, I guess, by constantly checking their understanding. We did this thing called an exit ticket to make sure that each student is understanding the lesson after we teach it. So the way I did that with pre-K students was, at the end of each lesson, kind of as their transition, I asked each student a question, and that was the way they transitioned to their next activity. So that way, if a student didn't answer the question right, I knew that they didn't understand the lesson, and I would have them stay on the carpet. And then, the rest of the students, if they got the questions right, would go to their seats. And the ones that were left on the carpet, I knew that they needed a little more teaching. So while the other students were working on something at their seats, I could stay with a small group on the carpet and kind of reteach the lesson right there to make sure that they understood it. I think that's a good way to ensure that every student is learning and becoming well educated. Because if you just call on a couple people, I know this was said in one of our books, but you don't know if all the students are learning or not. You just know that those couple students are learning. The third question, to what extent you create both an educational environment and learning experiences for students that honor and respect who they are. In terms of educational environment, I've always tried to make sure that we have books that represent everyone in the classroom, that things around the room represent everyone. I hang up their individual work so that they're reflected in the room. I always hang up a picture of my students and their families so they have that little part of home in the room. So, as much as I can, I try to represent everybody. And then, as far as learning experiences, I just really try to learn about each student individually and incorporate their interests and things about them into the lessons. Because I know that when the lessons mean something to the students, they're going to be more engaged with it. So if we're doing adding and I'm just saying, we're going to add 4 plus 5, that might not really do anything for them. But if I incorporate something like, I don't know, whatever they're into at the moment, like Dora. Dora had 5 apples and then Boots came over and gave her 4 more. They're going to be a little more interested because something that they're interested in is now part of the lesson. So I try to do that to kind of respect each student by learning about them and incorporating that into my lessons. Number 4, to what extent do you ask yourself uncomfortable questions about racism, cultural preferences, and insufficient learning conditions and resources that are obstacles to learning for many students. I have to say that I haven't asked myself these questions. When I see an obstacle for one of my students, I try to work around it. I don't really know if I'm personally asking myself any questions like that. So I know like one obstacle I saw that my students were having were the ELL students. We weren't allowed to speak Spanish to them. Everything had to be taught in English. But I still wanted to do the best that I could to make sure that they were getting the information and understanding the lessons. So I made sure I had a picture of everything printed out so I could show them what I was talking about, since I knew they weren't going to understand my words. So in terms of that, like when I see an obstacle, I try to address it, but I haven't actually like asked myself, I guess, specific questions like that. To what extent do you ask questions about racism, cultural preferences, and insufficient learning conditions and resources that are obstacles for others in your district school? Again, I don't think I've really asked the specific questions. When I notice something is an obstacle for people, I try to work around it. I know parent-teacher conferences were scheduled in one of my schools. They were scheduled like during the day when a lot of parents couldn't make it, not just in my classroom, but around the school. So I talked to the principal and asked if, the teachers, we could stay after, we could stay late into the evening, or even come in on a weekend, or go to their home and do it. Just any way that we could kind of, make sure that we met with every single parent, because I think that they're really important and it shouldn't just be on our timetable. And then things like holiday celebrations. We had, in one of my schools, we had a couple students in the schools who were Mormons, and they weren't allowed to celebrate any holidays, like even Mother's Day. Anything that was a celebration, they didn't do. So on those days, they would keep the students home, and I didn't think it was right for them to miss out on instruction because of that, because of our, bringing the specific cultures into the classroom, like Christmas and Thanksgiving and Halloween, because those aren't things that everybody celebrates, but by having them in our curriculum, certain students were missing out. And I did talk to the principal about not having those. I was overruled on that. So all I could do was make the celebrations as inclusive as possible, doing like a winter celebration instead of Christmas, Hanukkah, or anything themed like that. But, the students still weren't allowed to come to school, so I wouldn't say that was successful, but I did try there. To what extent do you engage in practices and policies that align with the belief that all students benefit from educational practices and engage them in learning about their cultural heritage and understand their cultural background? Honestly, I would say not enough. As far as incorporating their cultural heritage and background, I do things like, when we have events, I always invite the families in, depending on what it is. If they're bringing food, maybe they'll make a food that represents their culture, or if we are doing a holiday thing, I'll have parents come in and talk about specific traditions with their families. If we did a community lesson, we're talking about work, I have parents come in and talk about the work that they do to kind of incorporate their families' lives into the curriculum. But I guess I would say that it's not integrated enough. It's more like those special occasions kind of thing. 7, to what extent do you engage in facilitating dialogue regarding the influence of cultural understanding and historic distrust that can result in cultural discomfort and disagreements? Again, I would say that not enough. I guess never really have I facilitated a dialogue like that. I have had students or parents in the past that maybe didn't trust me coming in. I even had a parent tell me that once, that he came in and saw this little white lady and thought, oh boy, like, this is gonna be a great year. But to kind of combat that, I just did the best I could, getting to know each student and their parents, showing them personally that they could trust me by doing home visits, talking to them, one-on-one at pickup and drop off, sending home weekly individualized emails about, a great thing their kid did that week, or just trying to encourage positive communications to build that trust, but I've never actually facilitated a conversation saying like, you know, I know that history is here, why you might not trust me, etc. Number 8, think about your own assumptions and stereotypes about people from cultures other than yours, or about students whose living situations may be different to yours. How do assumptions and stereotypes block you from responding thoughtfully and respectfully towards others? I would just say that any assumptions and stereotypes can be harmful. They can, you know, block us from learning the real issue. Say like I had a student who never turned in their homework. Now I could just make an assumption that, you know, they're lazy or not smart or their parents don't care about their education. I could make any of those assumptions and then nothing would get done. Which, you know, in the beginning I did. I was just like, well, the parents obviously don't care. I don't know what else I can do. But then I talked to the parents. I realized that they're working 3 jobs. They didn't have time to help the kids with their homework. Or it might have been a language barrier. I've had students that, you know, parents that don't speak any English, so they couldn't understand the homework. So by moving past those assumptions, I was able to get to the root of the problem. And then, you know, I kept the kids after school with me or did their homework with them during the day so that their parents didn't have to do that because I knew they didn't have time, or made sure that the lessons were translated or had, you know, someone that was able to help them translate so they could understand the lessons. Number 9, to what extent do you engage in the implementation of educational practices and policies that improve instructional practices that effectively serve all students? I guess I just try and tailor everything I do to the needs of my specific students. So I guess I do that by learning about the individual students and their families at the beginning of the year. Like I had a student once who was always complaining that they were hungry, but they didn't get there in time for breakfast. We were not allowed to serve breakfast after 8 o'clock. If they weren't there by 8, they didn't get breakfast. But, you know, I talked to the parents, and they didn't have breakfast at home. They didn't get any food. So they were hungry when they came to school, and the mom couldn't get them there any earlier. So instead of just making the kid be hungry, I, you know, broke our policy and always left one breakfast out for that student to make sure that they could eat when they came to school. Because you can't focus on school and work if you're starving. I had another student that had a very hard time sitting still, and I could, you know, go by the policy. We all have to sit crisscross applesauce, hands in our laps, and just make that student, you know, suffer, not learn because they can't pay attention because they have to sit still like that. Or I could go against what, you know, the policy was that our students were supposed to do and let him move around a little, which I did because that's how he learned. And I would constantly ask him questions, and he was always listening. You wouldn't think he was because he was just moving around, but that's how he learned better. And as long as he was listening and getting the point of the lesson, that's what mattered. Number 10, to what extent do you engage in posing questions, collecting data, etc., to facilitate action plans into the larger school structure system to promote changes to policies, procedures, and practices? The only time I can really think of doing something to change a school policy was we had special monthly events at our school for students that I think either had perfect attendance or no tardies, something like that. And I started collecting data on the students that didn't qualify for these events. You know, and these students were always the ones they were very well behaved. They did all their homework. They were engaged in class. They were just great kids. And, you know, maybe they had a couple tardies, so then they weren't allowed to go to the special event. And these kids are 4 and 5, so they'd be crying, they'd be really upset. And it was just hard to explain to them, you know, your mom didn't get you to school on time once this month, so you can't go. And I just really didn't think that was fair, because if you're 4 or 5, you have no control over what time you get to school. It's up to your parents. So I, you know, talked to the principal about that. I showed them the data on, you know, if it was the same students month after month, and how I just didn't think it wasn't their fault. It wasn't in their control. And she said that was a policy. It should just be a motivation to the parents to get their kids to school on time. So, you know, I wasn't able to actually change anything, but I did speak up for what I thought, and I was disappointed with the outcome, but I at least said something about it. To what extent do you use data to understand more precisely the achievement status of all students? In my schools, we've always tested them at the beginning of the year, after each quarter, and then the end of the year. And we use that data to group them by ability for the ELA lessons and the math lessons. And then the students who were especially low or below grade level standard would have interventions where I would meet with them one-on-one daily and then assess their learning after each lesson and at the end of the week. That way I really knew what they were gaining each day, what they were understanding, what they weren't understanding, so that those gaps didn't grow. And all this data was, broken up for each student. So I knew exactly what each student was learning and where they were struggling. To what extent do you communicate across cultures and among diverse cultural groups about policy and practice to improve student learning? I wouldn't say that I have a lot of experience with that. When I have students that are struggling, I communicate personally with them or with their families. But other than that, it's just, meeting with teachers, instructional coach, assistant principal to discuss what strategies we can use to, better our instruction. Respond to the following. I'm not going to read that whole quote, but basically, leaders mobilize people to face problems, and communities make progress on problems because leaders challenge and help them to do so. I believe this is true. I agree that good leaders bring people together, that they help them communicate, that they inspire them to achieve, accomplish goal. They have that shared vision. And this isn't just in, formal leaders, like in education, for example, principals, superintendents, etc. Sometimes the more effective leaders are actually non-formal leaders, which one of our books talked about. And that could be, a well-respected parent, a student, a community member, anyone who can help bring people together and accomplish a goal. And the last question, respond to the following. To do nothing once informed is tantamount to the immoral position of conspirator. The moral position is to commit oneself to end oppression. What is your first reaction to this quote? To what extent do you demonstrate the willingness to facilitate this dialogue with others? When I first read this quote, it reminded me of, I think it was from the book, Why Are All the Black Children Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? But she talked about how you can be overtly racist, you can be passively racist, or you can be actively anti-racist. And I never really thought about it like that. I just assumed you're racist or you weren't racist. But if you're not doing something to stop racism, then you're being passively racist, and you're contributing to the problem. So I think the same thing applies to this, that once you have the information, if you're not committing yourself to end oppression, then you're part of it. So I think that for all of us, now that we're in this class, we're learning these things, we have this information, we have to have these conversations in our schools. I know that I always speak up when there's a policy or something in the curriculum that I don't agree with, and I don't think it's in the best interest of my students. This has caused me to, butt heads with administrators, to actually lose my job one year or not be asked back the next year. But that's not going to stop me. I might go about it a different way, but I'm definitely always going to stand up for what I think is best for my students. And now that I've, learned more about how these systemic problems, where, those things I wouldn't have thought about before, like overrepresentation in special education or disciplinary referrals, things like that, I'm going to look at those more and, definitely challenge the policies and practices based on that data. And that's it. Thanks.